The letter arrived on a Tuesday, typed in crisp Times New Roman, each word a precise little dagger aimed at my heart. I read it 3 times before the meaning fully sank in, my fingers trembling against the expensive cotton paper. Story time approaches. But first, where are you tuning in from today? Let us know in the comments. If you're new and love stories, that subscribe button is waiting. Shall we begin? My name is Ruth, and until 10 minutes ago, I thought I was living a modern fairy tale. Small-town librarian meets successful city banker, falls in love, gets engaged. But fairy tales don't usually include future mothers-in-law plotting to destroy their son's engagement. She's nothing but a social climber, the anonymous letter quoted Margaret Harrison saying. I'll make sure Tom sees sense before he ruins his life with that small-town nobody. I set the letter down on my kitchen counter, right next to the wedding magazine I'd been browsing earlier. The contrast was almost funny, all those perfect white dresses and smiling brides next to words dripping with such calculated venom. My phone buzzed. Tom's face lit up the screen, his smile warm and familiar. I let it ring. What was I supposed to say? Hey, honey, your mother's plotting to destroy our relationship? Ruth. My mother's voice carried through the open window from the backyard. The roses need trimming. Want to help? Not now, Mom. My voice cracked slightly. I heard her footsteps approaching the back door. She appeared in the doorway, pruning shears in hand, dirt smudged on her gardening apron. One look at my face and she set the shears down. What's wrong? I handed her the letter. Her eyes narrowed as she read. Her mouth settling into a thin line I recognized from my childhood, the expression she wore when dealing with particularly difficult parents at school. Well, she said finally, I can't say I'm entirely surprised. What do you mean? Margaret Harrison has been giving you the snake eye since day one. Remember that charity auction? The way she introduced you as Tom's friend even though you'd been engaged for 3 months? The memory stung. I'd written it off as forgetfulness, but now. What am I going to do? The question is, Mom said, settling into a kitchen chair, what do you want to do? The answer came surprisingly quick. I want to fight back. Ruth. No, Mom. I'm tired of pretending I don't notice the snide comments. The way she acts like I'm somehow not good enough for her precious family. I grabbed my phone as it buzzed again, another call from Tom. I'm going to prove her wrong. And how exactly do you plan to do that? I thought about Margaret's perfectly curated dinner parties, her carefully maintained image, her iron grip on her family's social standing. By finding out what she's hiding. Nobody's that perfect. You might not like what you find, Mom warned. And Tom needs to know who his mother really is. I picked up the letter again. She's having dinner with the Blakes tonight. I think it's time I paid Eleanor Blake a visit. Tom's grandmother? The one who never leaves her estate? The very same. I grabbed my car keys. She's the only one who knows all the Harrison family secrets. And I bet she'd love to share them with her future granddaughter-in-law. Mom stood up, concern etched on her face. Just remember, revenge has a way of hurting everyone involved. Including you. I paused at the door, my hand on the knob. I'm not looking for revenge, Mom. I'm looking for justice. But as I walked to my car, the letter burning a hole in my pocket, I wondered if there was really any difference between the two. Tom's name flashed on my phone screen again, and this time, I answered. Hey, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We need to talk. The Harrison mansion loomed before me like a challenge, all gleaming windows and manicured hedges. Tom squeezed my hand as we walked up the granite steps, but I barely felt it. The anonymous letter felt like it was burning through my purse, each step bringing me closer to its author. Margaret opened the door herself, perfect in pearls and a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Thomas, darling. She air-kissed his cheek, then turned to me. Ruth. That's an interesting dress choice. I smoothed down my carefully selected cocktail dress, remembering the 4 stores I'd visited to find something suitable. Thank you, Margaret. The color reminded me of the roses in your garden. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Well, do come in. Edward's already in the dining room. The house smelled of money and old secrets, leather-bound books, polished silver, and whatever expensive thing was being served for dinner. Edward stood as we entered, his quiet "Hello, Ruth" somehow warmer than his wife's entire greeting. I hear congratulations are in order, Margaret said as we settled around the massive dining table. The library received some sort of grant? Yes, I replied, noting how she made it sound like a consolation prize. We're expanding our children's literacy program. How quaint. Though I suppose that's important in areas like yours. Tom shifted uncomfortably. Mother. More wine? Edward interrupted, reaching for the bottle. I noticed his hand trembled slightly. The first course arrived, something delicate involving seafood that I barely tasted. Margaret dominated the conversation, dropping names of people I'd never meet and places I'd never visit. But I was watching her, really watching her for the first time. The way her eyes darted to Edward whenever certain names came up. The slight tightening of her fingers around her wine glass when Tom mentioned our wedding plans. Actually, Margaret said, setting down her fork, I've been meaning to discuss the wedding. The Blakes' country house would be perfect for the reception. Eleanor's quite fond of you, Thomas, and we've already booked the venue, I cut in. The old botanical gardens near my parents' house. Margaret's smile turned brittle. Oh, but surely you'd prefer somewhere more appropriate? The Blakes' property has hosted 3 governors' weddings. The gardens are perfect, Tom said firmly. Ruth and I both love it there. Love isn't everything, darling. Margaret's voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. Sometimes we must consider what's best for the family's future. I excused myself to use the bathroom, needing a moment away from her perfectly aimed barbs. In the hallway, I heard voices from behind a partially closed door, Margaret's study. No, it has to be handled carefully. Margaret's voice, sharp and clear. The girl's smarter than she looks. Yes, I know what's at stake. The merger depends on someone's coming. I'll call you back. I hurried past just as she emerged, our eyes meeting in a moment of perfect understanding. She knew I'd heard, and I knew she knew. Lost? Her smile was pure ice. Just heading back to dinner. I matched her tone. Wouldn't want to miss any of your helpful suggestions. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of subtle jabs and loaded silences. Tom grew increasingly tense, while Edward seemed to shrink into himself. When we finally left, Margaret's goodbye was almost triumphant. In the car, Tom turned to me. I'm sorry about Mother. She's just protective. Protective? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Tom, she's actively trying to stop our wedding. There's something bigger going on here, something about a merger? What merger? Ruth, you're not making sense. But I was making perfect sense. For the first time, everything was becoming clear. Margaret's opposition wasn't just about my social status, there was something else, something worth destroying her son's happiness over. I pulled out my phone and typed Eleanor Blake into the search bar. If Margaret wanted to play games, fine. But she'd forgotten something important: librarians know how to research. And I was just getting started. Eleanor Blake's estate made the Harrison mansion look modest. I sat across from her in a sunroom larger than my entire apartment. watching as she stirred honey into her tea with a silver spoon that probably cost more than my car. Margaret always was ambitious, Eleanor said, her voice carrying decades of carefully cultivated refinement. But you didn't drive all the way out here to discuss my daughter-in-law's personality, did you? No. I placed the newspaper clipping on the table between us. I came to ask about this. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the yellowed paper. The headline read, Blake Industries merger scandal, former secretary claims fraud. Where did you find this? Library archives. The secretary who made the allegations was Margaret Harrison. Before she married Edward. Eleanor set down her teacup with a sharp clink. That was 35 years ago. The article mentions evidence that could have destroyed Blake Industries. Evidence that mysteriously disappeared right after Margaret married Edward. You've done your homework. Eleanor's smile held a hint of approval. But what does ancient history have to do with your current situation? Yesterday, I overheard Margaret talking about another merger. One that apparently depends on stopping my wedding to Tom. Eleanor's expression shifted, something dark passing behind her eyes. The Whitmore deal. What? Thomas hasn't told you? The Whitmores are trying to acquire Harrison Financial. They have a daughter about Thomas's age. Very suitable match, in Margaret's opinion. My stomach churned. Tom wouldn't. No, he wouldn't. That's why Margaret's getting desperate. Eleanor reached for an ornate bell on the side table. Jenkins, bring me the blue folder from my study. While we waited, Eleanor studied me with unnerving intensity. You remind me of Margaret, you know. Before she learned to value position over principle. The butler returned with a leather folder. Eleanor removed several documents, spreading them across the table. The evidence Margaret claimed to have? It never disappeared. I've kept it all these years, insurance against exactly this sort of situation. My hands shook as I read. Bank statements, letters, forged documents, everything that proved the original Blake Harrison merger was built on fraud. Why are you showing me this? Because Margaret's about to sacrifice her son's happiness to protect her position. Again. Eleanor's voice hardened. History doesn't just repeat itself, my dear. It's forced to repeat by people who refuse to learn from it. My phone buzzed, a text from Tom, where are you? Mother's called an emergency family meeting. Go, Eleanor said, gathering the documents. But remember, weapons only work if you're willing to use them. I drove to the Harrison house in a daze, the implications of Eleanor's revelations spinning through my mind. The family was already gathered in the living room when I arrived. Margaret stood by the fireplace, triumph written across her face. Ruth, how nice of you to join us. Her smile was razor sharp. I was just explaining to Thomas about the Whitmore opportunity. How it could secure his future, our family's future. By having him marry someone else? The words came out before I could stop them. Tom stood up. What? The merger depends on it, doesn't it, Margaret? I met her gaze steadily. Just like the Blake merger 35 years ago? The color drained from Margaret's face. Edward looked up sharply. I don't know what you're talking about, Margaret said, but her voice wavered. I think you do. And so does Eleanor. The room went silent. Tom looked between us, confusion giving way to understanding. Mother, what is she talking about? Margaret's composure cracked. Everything I did for this family. No, I said quietly. You did it for yourself. And now you're trying to do it again. I reached for my phone, pulling up the photos I'd taken of Eleanor's documents. Should I share these with everyone? Or should we discuss how this ends differently this time? Margaret's hands gripped the mantelpiece, her knuckles white. The choice hung in the air between us, her past or her son's future. And in her eyes, I saw she knew exactly which one I'd choose. The documents from Eleanor's folder lay scattered across my kitchen table like landmines. Tom stood by the window, his silence heavier than any argument we could have had. Outside, rain pelted against the glass, matching my thundering pulse. "You went behind my back." His voice was quiet, controlled. "To my grandmother. Your mother went behind both our backs." I touched one of the papers, proof of Margaret's past deceptions. "She's trying to marry you off to someone else." "That's not the point, Ruth." He turned, and I barely recognized the expression on his face. "You're turning into her." The accusation hit like a physical blow. "I'm nothing like Margaret." "Really? Secret meetings, digging up dirt, using people's past against them?" He picked up one of Eleanor's documents. "What exactly was your plan here?" "To protect us." "By destroying my family?" My carefully constructed justifications crumbled. In the harsh light of Tom's disappointment, I saw what I'd become, someone who'd let revenge mask itself as righteousness. The doorbell rang, making us both jump. Through the front window, I saw Edward Harrison's car in my driveway. Tom opened the door. Edward stood there, soaked from the rain, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "May I come in?" I gathered the documents quickly, but Edward waved them away. "I know what those are." "I've always known." "Then why didn't you ever say anything?" Tom demanded. "Because I loved her." Edward sank into a kitchen chair. "And because I was a coward." "Still am, probably. But I can't watch her do to you what she did to us." "What do you mean?" "The Whitmore merger isn't just about business, Tom. It's about Margaret's revenge against Eleanor. The Whitmores were involved in the original scandal, they helped cover it up. If this merger goes through, it'll protect everyone involved. Everyone except Eleanor." My phone buzzed, a text from Margaret, "We need to talk." "Alone." "She's trying to divide us," Tom said, reading over my shoulder. "No." I stood up. "She's offering me a choice." "Ruth. I need to see this through." I grabbed my car keys. "But not the way I planned." Tom caught my arm. "What are you going to do?" I thought about Eleanor's words about weapons, about Margaret's desperate grip on her perfect life. About how easily I'd let myself become what I claimed to hate. "I'm going to give her what she never gave anyone else," I said. "A chance to choose differently." Edward spoke up. "Margaret doesn't believe in second chances." "Maybe not. But I still do." I touched Tom's face. "That's the difference between us." The drive to the Harrison mansion felt like crossing a boundary. Margaret waited in her study, perfectly composed except for the slight tremor in her hands as she poured 2 glasses of wine. "I assume you've come to negotiate," she said, offering me a glass. I didn't take it. "No. I came to tell you I'm not using Eleanor's documents." Surprise flickered across her face. "Why?" "Because I don't want to win that way." I met her gaze steadily. "But I'm not backing down either. Tom deserves to choose his own path. Just like you deserved to choose yours 35 years ago. You know nothing about my choices. I know you were like me once. Before you decided status was worth more than happiness." I moved toward the door. "The difference is, I'm choosing differently. And if I don't back down?" I paused, hand on the doorknob. "Then you'll lose Tom anyway. But this time, it'll be your choice, not mine." Walking away from Margaret's study felt like emerging from a dark room into sunlight. Tom waited in my driveway when I got home, and the way he looked at me told me I'd made the right choice. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't won by fighting, but by refusing to become what we're fighting against. The annual Harrison family gathering felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. I watched from the edge of the grand ballroom as Margaret worked the crowd, her laugh carrying across the room with practiced ease. The Whitmores were here too, their daughter Claire hovering near Tom with predatory grace. Eleanor caught my eye from her corner seat, raising her glass slightly. The documents she'd given me felt heavy in my clutch, though I'd promised myself I wouldn't use them. Quite the turnout. Edward appeared beside me, his bow tie slightly askew. Margaret's outdone herself. Is that what we're calling it? He flinched at my tone. Ruth, about the merger. Don't. I watched as Claire touched Tom's arm, laughing at something he'd said. You had 35 years to speak up. And you have 30 seconds before Margaret makes her announcement. My head snapped toward him. What announcement? But Margaret was already clinking her glass, drawing everyone's attention. Tom's eyes found mine across the room, a warning in them I couldn't quite read. Family, friends, Margaret's voice carried effortlessly. We're gathered not just for our annual celebration, but for a special announcement. Harrison Financial and Whitmore Industries are joining forces. Polite applause. I felt the trap closing. And to cement this union, Margaret continued, we're thrilled to announce the engagement of Thomas Harrison to Claire Whitmore. The room erupted in congratulations. Tom stood frozen, his face pale. Claire beamed, already moving to take his arm. He hasn't agreed, I said to Edward. He doesn't have to. The contracts were signed this morning. If he refuses, both companies face bankruptcy. The documents in my clutch suddenly felt like a lifeline instead of a burden. One move and I could burn it all down, Margaret's reputation, the merger, everything. Don't. Eleanor's voice behind me was soft but firm. That's exactly what she wants. To prove you're no different from her. Then what am I supposed to do? Let her win? You're asking the wrong question. Eleanor's eyes were sharp. Ask yourself why she's so desperate to stop you. I looked around the room, at Margaret's triumphant smile, at Edward's defeated posture, at Tom's barely contained fury. Then I saw it. The slight tremor in Margaret's hand as she raised her glass. The way her eyes kept darting to the Whitmores. The desperate edge to her perfect performance. She wasn't trying to stop my wedding. She was trying to save herself. I moved through the crowd toward Tom, aware of every eye tracking my progress. Claire stepped closer to him, practically marking her territory. Thomas, Margaret called out, perhaps you'd like to say a few words about your engagement? The room went quiet. Tom looked at me, then at his mother, then at the expectant faces surrounding us. I saw the weight of family legacy crushing him, just as it had crushed Edward all those years ago. I reached into my clutch, fingers brushing Eleanor's documents. One move would expose everything, the fraud, the lies, the decades of manipulation. Justice, revenge, whatever you wanted to call it, was right there. Instead, I pulled out my engagement ring. Actually, I said, my voice carrying in the silence, I have something to say. Margaret's smile froze. Eleanor leaned forward in her chair. Tom watched me with a mixture of fear and hope. I held up the ring, letting it catch the light. This ring belonged to my grandmother. She was a housekeeper for a family like yours. They treated her like she was nothing. But she taught me something important. Our worth isn't in who we marry or what we own. It's in the choices we make. I turned to Margaret. You made your choice 35 years ago. Now it's Tom's turn. The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, watching Margaret's carefully constructed world balance on a knife's edge, I realized something important. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't in destroying your enemy's world. It's in refusing to play their game at all. The silence after my speech lasted exactly 3 seconds before Margaret's laugh cut through it like a knife. How touching. But perhaps we should discuss what's really at stake here. She pulled out her own envelope, and my stomach dropped. I recognized Eleanor's handwriting on the front. "Mother," Tom warned, stepping forward. "No, Thomas. It's time everyone knew exactly who they're dealing with." Margaret's voice carried across the ballroom. "Did Ruth tell you how she obtained evidence about our family? How she conspired with Eleanor to blackmail us?" The crowd murmured. Claire Whitmore's triumphant smile made my skin crawl. "That's not what happened," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to me. "No?" Margaret opened the envelope. "Then explain these emails between you and Eleanor, plotting to expose the merger's history. Plotting to destroy not just my reputation, but the livelihoods of hundreds of employees who depend on both companies." Tom turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Is this true?" I never intended. The words stuck in my throat as I watched Margaret produce printout after printout. "Of course you didn't intend," Margaret's voice dripped with false sympathy. "Just like you didn't intend to use my past against me. To exploit an old woman's bitterness for your own gain." Eleanor stood up shakily. "That's enough, Margaret." "Is it?" "Because I have more. About Ruth's midnight visits to your house, about the documents she copied without permission. About her plans to reveal everything at this very gathering." Each word was a nail in my coffin. I watched as the room turned against me, saw the doubt creep into even Edward's sympathetic gaze. "Ruth." Tom's voice cracked slightly. "Tell me you didn't do this." But I had done it. All of it. The investigation, the secret meetings, the planned exposure, everything except the final reveal. And now Margaret had turned my own weapon against me, making me look exactly like what I'd accused her of being. A manipulative social climber willing to destroy a family for personal gain. "I was trying to protect us," I whispered. "By becoming exactly what you claimed to hate?" Tom's words echoed my own thoughts from days ago. Claire slipped her arm through Tom's. "I think we all know what this is really about. A small-town girl who couldn't handle the fact that she didn't belong." I looked around the room, at the faces that had turned from curious to condemning, at Eleanor's defeated posture, at Edward's averted gaze. Even the servants seemed to be avoiding eye contact. "Tom," I reached for him, but he stepped back. "I think," Margaret said quietly, "it would be best if you left." The walk to the door felt endless. Each step echoed against the marble floor, accompanied by whispers and judgmental stares. I'd come here planning to expose Margaret's true nature, but instead, I'd revealed my own. At the doorway, I turned back one last time. Tom stood frozen between his mother and Claire, looking lost and betrayed. Margaret's victory was complete. She'd managed to make me destroy myself without lifting a finger. "Congratulations," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "You win." "Oh, Ruth," Margaret smiled sadly. "I won the moment you decided to play my game." Outside, the night air hit me like a slap. My phone buzzed, a message from Eleanor, "I'm sorry." She found my phone. She knew we were meeting. Another buzz, "Tom, I need time." A final message from Margaret, "The invitation to the wedding will be in the mail. Do be a dear and don't attend." I sat in my car, staring at the Harrison mansion glowing warmly against the dark sky. Everything I'd fought against, everything I'd tried to prevent, had happened anyway. And worse, I'd proven Margaret right about me all along. The engine started with a quiet purr. As I pulled away from the curb, I caught a glimpse of movement in an upstairs window, Edward, watching me leave. In that moment, I finally understood him completely. Sometimes the price of fighting monsters isn't that you become one. It's that you realize you were capable of being one all along. The wedding invitation arrived exactly as Margaret promised. I stared at the cream-colored envelope for a long moment before reaching for my car keys instead. 3 weeks of silence was enough. The Whitmore mansion blazed with pre-wedding celebration lights. I parked across the street, watching the shadows of guests moving behind gauzy curtains. Then I saw her, Margaret, slipping out onto the balcony alone, a champagne flute in her trembling hand. Security was laughably easy to bypass. Years of library work had taught me every building had its service entrances, its quiet corners, its forgotten paths. Enjoying your victory? I stepped out of the shadows onto the balcony. Margaret didn't turn around. You shouldn't be here. Neither should you. I moved beside her, looking out over the manicured gardens. The Whitmores are going to find out eventually. About the fraud, about Eleanor's evidence, all of it. They already know. Her laugh was hollow. They've always known. Why do you think they insisted on this marriage? The pieces clicked into place. They're blackmailing you. Welcome to high society, dear. She drained her glass. Where everyone knows everyone else's secrets, and we all pretend not to notice the knives in our backs. Then why fight so hard to stay in it? Because the alternative is becoming nothing. Her voice cracked. Like I was before. Like you are now. The door behind us opened. Tom stood there, his bow tie askew, Claire's lipstick on his collar. The sight hit harder than I expected. Ruth. His voice was barely a whisper. Don't worry, I said. I'm not here to stop your wedding. Then why are you here? Margaret turned finally, her perfect mask slipping. To show you something. I pulled out my phone, opened the email I'd received that morning. The library board approved my proposal. We're starting a foundation for adult education. First-generation college students, single parents, people looking for second chances. Margaret's eyes narrowed. And I'm naming it after you. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble. Tom took a step forward, but I continued. The Margaret Harrison Second Chance Foundation. For people who want to change their lives without losing themselves. Like you could have, 35 years ago. You're mocking me. No. I'm offering you what you never offered anyone else, a way out that doesn't require destruction. The balcony fell silent except for the distant sounds of the party. Tom looked between us, understanding dawning in his eyes. The merger, he said slowly. The Whitmores, they're using something from your past? Margaret's hands gripped the balcony rail. Thomas. Tell him, I said quietly. Or I will. But this time, it won't be about revenge. It'll be about truth. She broke. The whole story spilled out, her humble beginnings, the original fraud, the years of covering it up. With each word, her perfect posture crumbled until she was just a woman, tired of carrying decades of lies. Tom listened silently, his face unreadable. When she finished, he looked at me. You knew all this? And you didn't use it? I learned from the best, I met Margaret's gaze, what happens when you let revenge consume you. The party music swelled inside, Claire's laugh carrying through the glass doors. Tom straightened his bow tie with trembling fingers. I have to go back in, he said. They're expecting. No. Margaret's voice was firm. No more expectations. No more perfect lies. She turned to me. Your foundation, does it need a board member? Mother? Tom's surprise mirrored my own. The Whitmores can't blackmail me with a past I'm not hiding anymore. She smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. Besides, I have some experience with second chances now. I left them there, mother and son, their shadows merging in the balcony light. As I drove away, my phone buzzed with a text from Tom, wait for me? Sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning the game, but from changing its rules entirely. The Margaret Harrison Second Chance Foundation opened on a crisp autumn morning. I watched from the podium as Margaret cut the ribbon, her hands steady, her smile genuine. The crowd, a mix of society figures and future students, applauded politely, uncertain how to react to this new version of Margaret Harrison. "Ready for the tour?" I asked as the crowd dispersed. She ran her hand along the brass nameplate. "It's smaller than I expected. We start small. Grow authentically." I led her through the converted warehouse. Like you could have, if you'd had the chance. Students were already filling the classrooms, their voices echoing through halls still smelling of fresh paint. A woman about Margaret's age sat in the front row of the computer literacy class, her work-worn hands hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. Margaret paused in the doorway. "That could have been me. It still can be." I handed her a course catalog. The board position includes mandatory participation in at least one class. Her laugh was surprised, genuine. "Clever girl." In the main office, Edward was hanging pictures, not of society galas or corporate mergers, but of real moments. Margaret's first day as a secretary. Eleanor's childhood home. The small church where Margaret and Edward had originally planned to marry before society expectations changed everything. The Whitmores sent this. Margaret handed me an envelope. Inside was a check, a substantial one, and a note for second chances. "They're not as powerful without secrets to hold over people," I observed. "No," she agreed. "None of us are." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows as we reached the library, my pride and joy. Tom was there, shelving books alongside my father. They'd been working together lately, Tom learning carpentry, Dad learning to trust again. "The Foundation's first donation," Margaret said, pulling a book from her bag. Her old secretary handbook, pages dog-eared and marked. "For those who want to learn how to climb without falling." I placed it on the shelf marked New Beginnings. "You know," Margaret said quietly, "I spent so long trying to bury that scared young secretary, I forgot she was the strongest part of me." "She still is." I touched the handbook's worn spine. "Strong enough to start over." Eleanor arrived as we were closing up, leaning on her cane but standing straighter than I'd ever seen her. "Well, this is certainly not what I expected when I gave you those documents." "No," I agreed. "It's better." The four of us, Eleanor, Margaret, Tom, and I, stood in the fading light of the library. Not quite whole, not quite healed, but something new taking shape. "The board meets Tuesday mornings," I told Margaret. "Business casual dress code." She smoothed her designer suit. "I'll have to go shopping." "I know a great thrift store," Eleanor offered, and for once, there was no barb in the suggestion. Tom slipped his hand into mine as they left, Margaret and Eleanor walking together, their shadows long in the setting sun. "Think it'll work?" he asked. I watched Margaret stop to help a student struggling with the door, saw the natural grace in the gesture. "I think we all deserve the chance to try." We locked up together, the keys heavy in my hand. Through the window, I could see the Foundation's motto etched in gold: "Every ending is a beginning in disguise." The anonymous letter that started everything still sat in my desk drawer. I took it out now, reading those angry words that had nearly driven me to destroy rather than create. Then I dropped it in the recycling bin. Some might call this a happy ending. But standing there in our imperfect creation, watching Margaret Harrison learn to be real instead of perfect, I realized it wasn't an ending at all. It was just the first step on a longer road, one where justice looked like growth instead of vengeance. Where victory meant changing hearts instead of breaking them, and where the hardest person to offer a second chance to is often yourself.